First, I will have a short question. It is a question with two parts. You are a so-called new historian, and I want you to explain what a new historian is. And the second is that we often hear in Norway there is a way of thinking that his new historian found out this and that. So one will not distinguish between what different new historians are saying. So my question to you is, what is the distinction between you and, let's say, Ilan Pappe?
Okay. Well, firstly, as you can see, I'm not a particularly new historian. But I was relatively new 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, two things happened. 20 years ago being the 1980s. Israel essentially began to open its archives, also of the 1948 period. The Western world, especially England, opened its archives in line with the 30-year rule. So a large amount of material about what had happened around 48, in 48, became available. And the other thing which happened in the 1980s was that a new generation of scholars sort of reached adulthood or maturity as scholars and began to research the subject of 48 relatively unhampered by ideology and prejudice and education or even commitment. They weren't as ardent Zionists as had been those who wrote Israeli history in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Most of them people who had actually participated either in the 48 war or the state building itself. For them, it was a personal moment of glory. They certainly weren't going to look at it objectively and certainly not tarnish it. The historians who grew up in the 70s and 80s, especially the 80s, began to write their books in the 80s, may have been, some of them committed Zionists like myself, or anti-Zionists like Pappe, Ilan Pappe, but they were certainly not in thrall to the party, the army, the state, and its interests in terms of their profession, in terms of their history writing. And so in the 80s, a series of books came out, the most important of which I would say was Avi Schleim's book, Collusion Across the Jordan, describing Israeli Hashemite relations from the 1920s onwards, especially around 48. Avi Schleim is a professor of history in Oxford. Tom Segev's book at the time on the 7th Million on Israel and the Holocaust, and Israel and the Holocaust survivors, Israeli attitudes, Yeshuv attitudes, and Israeli attitudes to what had happened to the Jews of Europe or to the Jews who remained, survived the Holocaust. My own book on the refugees apparently was also important, on the creation of the refugee problem. And this sort of came as I decided at some point to call this new historiography and our collection of people who weren't working together new historians, and the term fit, and of course vilifying the previous generation as old historians who had not written honestly or properly about what had happened before 48, in 48, and even after 48. So that's where the term comes from, and this clash. It's a generational clash between historians. It's revisionist versus traditional, which is normal in history throughout the world, in every country. You've got waves. I mean, otherwise there would be no point in writing history. Everybody would be writing the same thing. So there's always new waves, new material, new thinking, which comes to the fore. And in Israel, it happened in the 1980s, and it focused largely on the subject of 48 because that's the revolutionary year in which the big things happened. Everything sort of streamed into 48, and everything streamed out of 48. And of course, the Holocaust was another major subject, not of that type of revisionism, but in the particular context of how Israel and the Yeshuv related to the Holocaust. Should it have done more? Could it have done more? Did they treat the Holocaust survivors nicely with enough respect? Or did they dismiss them as a bunch of sheep? You know, this sort of controversy was raised again, as I say, by new historians like Tom Segev. Among the historians, I said some were Zionists and some weren't, even though I was seen as an anti-Zionist, as were the other new historians, because we were questioning accepted myths and narrative. Some of us were Zionists and some weren't. And some, growingly, I think, since the 80s, used the new historiography for political purposes. I don't think I did that, but Ilan Pappe certainly did that, and he said he did. He said his worldview, or his view of himself as an historian, is that historians should subordinate their historical writing, their historiography, to political purposes. He says that. He says they all do. Every historian does it, and I do so consciously. And he was as I say, left-wing, anti-Israeli, in fact, anti-Zionist. He has since moved to England, in fact. And he wrote with a thoroughly, consistently political purpose about the history of Zionism in Israel. My view was that history should serve, historical writing should serve no purpose other than simply to illuminate the past, to try and get the story right, to describe it as accurately as possible, and let the reader judge morally, if he likes, how the actors in various points in time acted, in terms of judging them, if you like. I don't believe that historians should judge people. I mean, in extreme cases, Hitler kills 6 million people or 50 million people or whatever it is. Obviously, there's a evil, and you have to, or don't have to, but it's obvious, implicit that you have a moral judgment. But in most cases in history, things are much grayer, not clear, more ambiguous, and historians should simply write what the documents tell them happened, and let the reader decide who acted nicely and wisely and who was acted unwisely and, if you like, immorally. So at the moment, some of the new historians, and one last sentence, the Second Intifada, which broke out in the year 2000, it lasted, say, until now, 2004, was such a violent and controversial bout of hostilities, terrorism, Israeli reprisals, and so on, that it sent new historians sort of spinning in different directions politically. This is what happened. Pappe was a mild anti-Zionist, say, down to the 1990s, and became a very firm anti-Zionist, in fact, a propagandist, I would say, in terms of his writing. It's not serious history. As a result, partly of the impact of the Second Intifada and what he believed had been happening to the Palestinians. Some people say that the Second Intifada sent me into the opposite direction, rightwards, in terms of my support for Israel and Zionism. Judged by the books, the historical books, I try to separate my political views and writing from my history.